The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 1, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 1, Side 2. 5. The Etruscan Domination. About 655 B.C., proceeds the tradition, Demaratus, a rich merchant banished from Corinth, came to live in Tarquinii, and married an Etruscan woman. His son, Lucius Tarquinius, migrated to Rome, rose to high position there, and on the death of Ancus, either seized the throne or, more probably, was chosen to it by a coalition of Etruscan families in the city. He was the first, says Livy, who canvassed for the crown and delivered a set speech to secure the support of the plebs, that is, those citizens who could not trace their ancestry to the founding fathers. Under this Tarquinius Priscus, the monarchy increased its power over the aristocracy, and Etruscan influence grew in Roman politics, engineering, religion, and art. Tarquin fought successfully against the Sabines and subjugated all Latium. He used the resources of Rome, we are told, to adorn Tarquinii and other Etruscan cities, but also he brought Etruscan and Greek artists to his capital and beautified it with majestic temples. Apparently he represented the glowing power of business and finance against the landed aristocracy. After a reign of 38 years, the first Tarquin was assassinated by the patricians, who aimed to limit the kingship again to a religious role. But Tarquin's widow, Tanaquil, took charge of the situation and was able to transmit the throne to her son, Servius Tullius. Servius, says Cicero, was the first to hold the royal power without being chosen by the people, that is, by the leading families. He governed well and built a protective moat and wall around Rome, but the great landowners resented his rule and plotted to unseat him. Consequently, he allied himself with the richer members of the plebs and reorganized the army and the voters to strengthen his position. Taking a census of persons and property, he classified the citizens according to wealth rather than birth, so that while leaving the old aristocracy intact, he raised up as a balance to it a class of equites, literally horsemen, men who could equip themselves with horse, equus, and armor to serve in the cavalry. The census reported some 80,000 persons capable of bearing arms, reckoning one woman and one child for each soldier, and a slave for every fourth family. We may estimate at 260,000 the population of Rome and its subject environs, about 560 B.C. Servius divided the people into 35 new tribes, arranging them according to place of residence rather than kinship or rank. Thereby, like Cleisthenes a generation later in Attica, he weakened the political cohesion and voting power of the aristocracy, the class that rated itself supreme by birth. When another Tarquin, grandson of Tarquinius Priscus, charged Servius with ruling illegally, he submitted himself to a plebiscite and received, says Livy, a unanimous vote. Unconvinced, Tarquin had Servius assassinated and announced himself king. Under Tarquinius Superbus, the Proud, the monarchy became absolute and Etruscan influence supreme. The patricians had thought of the Rex as the executive of the Senate and chief priest of the national religion. They could not long consent to unlimited royal power. Therefore, they had killed Tarquinius Priscus and had raised no hand to protect Servius. But this new Tarquin was worse than the first. He surrounded himself with a bodyguard, degraded freemen with months of forced labor, had citizens crucified in the Forum, put to death many leaders of the upper class, and ruled with an insolent brutality that won him the hatred of all influential men. Thinking to gain popularity by successful wars, he attacked the Rutuli and the Volscians. While he was with the army, the Senate assembled and deposed him, in 508 B.C., in one of the great turning points of Roman history. 6. The Birth of the Republic. Here the tradition becomes literature, and the prose of politics is fused into the poetry of love. One evening, says Livy, in the king's camp at Ardea, his son Sextus Tarquin was debating with a relative, Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the comparative virtue of their wives. Collatinus proposed that they should take horse to Rome and surprise their ladies in the late hours of the night. They found the wife of Sextus feasting with intimates, but Lucretia, wife of Collatinus, was spinning wool for her husband's clothing. Sextus was inflamed with desire to try Lucretia's fidelity and enjoy her love. A few days later, he returned secretly to the home of Lucretia and overcame her by wile and force. Lucretia sent for her father and her husband, told them what had happened, and then stabbed herself to death. Thereupon, Lucius Junius Brutus, a friend of Collatinus, called upon all good men to drive the Tarquins from Rome. He himself was a nephew of the king, but his father and his brother had been put to death by Tarquin, and he had gained his cognomen Brutus, that is, idiot, by pretending lunacy so that he might be spared for his revenge. Now he rode with Collatinus to the capital, told Lucretia's story to the Senate, and persuaded it to banish all the royal family. The king had meanwhile left the army and hurried to Rome. Brutus, apprised of this, rode out to the army, told Lucretia's story again, and won the soldiers' support. Tarquin fled north and appealed to Etruria to restore him to his throne. An assembly of the citizen soldiers was now convened, and instead of a king chosen for life, it elected 2 consuls, with equal and rival powers, to rule for a year. These first consuls, says the tradition, were Brutus and Collatinus, but Collatinus resigned and was replaced by Publius Valerius, who won the name Publicola, friend of the people, by putting through the assembly several laws that remained basic in Rome: that any man who should try to make himself king might be killed without trial, that any attempt to take a public office without the people's consent should be punishable with death, and that any citizen condemned by a magistrate to death or flogging should have the right of appeal to the assembly. It was Valerius who inaugurated the custom whereby a consul, upon entering the assembly, must part the axes from the rods and lower them as a sign of the people's sovereignty and sole right in peace to impose a sentence of death. The revolution had 2 main results. It freed Rome from Etruscan ascendancy and replaced the monarchy with an aristocracy that ruled Rome until Caesar. The political position of the poorer citizens was not improved. On the contrary, they were required to surrender the lands that Servius had given them, and they lost the modest measure of protection with which the monarchy had shielded them from aristocratic domination. The victors called the revolution a triumph of liberty, but now and then liberty in the slogans of the strong means freedom from restraint in the exploitation of the weak. The expulsion of the Tarquins from Rome, added to the defeat of the Etruscans by Greek colonists at Cumae in 524, threatened to end Etruscan leadership in central Italy. Responding for these reasons to Tarquin's appeal, Lars Porsena, chief magistrate of Clusium, collected an army from the federated cities of Etruria and advanced upon Rome. At the same time, an attempt was made in Rome itself to restore Tarquin. The 2 sons of Brutus were among the arrested conspirators, and the fiery first consul provided an exemplar, perhaps a myth, for all later Romans when he witnessed in stoic silence the flogging and beheading of his children. The Romans destroyed the Tiber bridges before Porsena could reach them. It was in this defense of the bridgeheads that Horatius Cocles immortalized himself in Latin and English lays. Despite this and other legends with which defeat tried to cover itself with glory, Rome surrendered to Porsena and yielded portions of her territory to Veii and to the Latin towns that had been despoiled by Rome's kings. Porsena showed his good taste by not demanding the restoration of Tarquin. In Etruria, too, by this time, aristocracy had driven out monarchy. Rome was weakened for a generation, but her revolution remained. The Etruscan power had been expelled, but the marks and relics of Etruscan influence were to survive in Roman civilization to its end. That influence was apparently least on the Latin language. Nevertheless, the Roman numerals are probably Etruscan, and the name Roma may have come from the Etruscan Rumon, or river. The Romans believed that they had taken from Etruria the ceremonies of a returning conqueror's triumph, the purple-hemmed robes and ivory curule, or chariot-like seat of the magistrates, and the rods and axes carried before each consul by 12 lictors in token of his authority to strike and kill. The coins of Rome, centuries before she had a fleet, were adorned with the prow of a ship, long used in the coinage of Etruria to symbolize her commercial activity and naval power. From the 7th to the 4th centuries B.C., it was a custom among Roman aristocrats to send their sons to Etruscan cities for higher education. There, among other things, they learned geometry, surveying, and architecture. Roman dress derived from the Etruscan, or both from a common source. The first actors, and their name histriones, came to Rome from Etruria. It was Tarquinius Priscus, if we may believe Livy, who built the first Circus Maximus and imported racehorses and pugilists from Etruria for Roman games. The Etruscans gave Rome brutal gladiatorial contests, but they also transmitted to Rome a higher status of woman than could be found in Greece. Etruscan engineers built the walls and sewers of Rome, and turned it from a swamp into a protected and civilized capital. From Etruria, Rome took most of her religious ritual, her augurs, haruspices, and soothsayers. As late as Julian, in AD 363, Etruscan soothsayers were an official part of every Roman army. With Etruscan rites, Romulus was believed to have laid out the limits of Rome. From the same source came the Roman wedding ceremony, with its symbolism of capture, and the Roman ceremonial funeral. Rome took her musical modes and instruments from Etruria. Most of her artists were Etruscans, and the Roman street where the artists worked was called Vicus Tuscus. The arts themselves, however, may have filtered in through Latium from the Campanian Greeks. Sculptural portraiture in Rome was deeply influenced by the death masks made for the family gallery, a custom taken from Etruria. Etruscan sculptors adorned the temples and palaces of Rome with bronze statuary and terracotta figures and reliefs. Etruscan architects bequeathed to Rome a Tuscan style that still survives in the colonnade of St. Peter's Church. Etruscan kings at Rome seem to have built her first large edifices and to have transformed Rome from an assemblage of earthen or wooden huts into a city of wood, brick, and stone. Not till Caesar would Rome see again so much building as under Etruscan rule. We must not exaggerate. However much Rome learned from her neighbors, she remained, in all the basic features of life, distinctively herself. Nothing in Etruscan history quite suggests the Roman character, the grave self-discipline, the cruelty and courage, the patriotism and stoic devotion that patiently conquered and then patiently ruled the Mediterranean states. Now Rome was free, and the stage was cleared for the incomparable drama of the grandeur and decline of paganism in the ancient world. Book 1. The Republic, 508 to 530 B.C. Chapter 2. The Struggle for Democracy, 508 to 264 B.C. 1. Patricians and Plebs. Who were the patricians? Livy thought that Romulus had chosen 100 clan heads of his tribe to help him establish Rome and be his council or senate. These men were later called patres, fathers, and their descendants, patricii, derived from the fathers. Modern theory, which lives by nibbling at tradition, likes to explain the patricians as alien conquerors, perhaps Sabines who invaded Latium and thereafter ruled the Latin plebs or populace as a lower caste. We may believe that they were composed of clans that through economic or military superiority had acquired the best lands and had transformed their agricultural leadership into political mastery. These victorious clans, the Manlii, Valerii, Aemilii, Cornelii, Fabii, Horatii, Claudii, Julii, etc., continued for 5 centuries to give Rome generals, consuls, and laws. When the 3 original tribes united, their clan heads made a senate of some 300 members. They were not such lords of comfort and luxury as their descendants. Often they put their own hands to the axe or the plough, lived vigorously on simple fare, and wore clothing spun in their homes. The plebs admired them even when it fought them, and applied to almost anything appertaining to them the term classicus, classical, that is, of the highest rank or class. Close to them in wealth, but far below them in political power, were the equites, or businessmen. Some were rich enough to win their way into the Senate, and formed there the second part of its constituent, patres et conscripti, that is, patricians and co-inscribed men. These 2 classes were called the orders, and were termed boni, the good. For early civilizations thought of virtue in terms of rank, ability, and power. Virtus to the Roman meant manliness, the qualities that make a man, or vir. Populus, people, took in only these upper classes, and originally it was in this sense that those famous initials were used, SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, which were to mark so proudly 100,000 monuments. Gradually, as democracy fought its way, the word populus came to include the plebs. This was the main body of Roman citizens. Some were artisans or tradesmen, some were freedmen, many were peasants. Perhaps in the beginning they were the conquered natives of the city's hills. Some were attached as clientes or dependents to an upper-class patronus. In return for land and protection they helped him in peace, served under him in war, and voted in the assemblies as he told them. Lowest of all were the slaves. Under the kings they had been costly and few, and therefore had been treated with consideration as valuable members of the family. In the 6th century B.C., when Rome began her career of conquest, war captives were sold in rising number to the aristocracy, the business classes, and even to plebeians. And the status of the slave sank. Legally, he could be dealt with as any other piece of property. In theory, and according to the custom of the ancients, his life had been forfeited by defeat, and his enslavement was a merciful commutation of his death. Sometimes he managed his master's property, business, or funds. Sometimes he became a teacher, writer, actor, craftsman, laborer, tradesman, or artist, and paid his master part of his earnings. In this or other ways he might earn enough to buy his freedom and become a member of the plebs. Contentment is as rare among men as it is natural among animals, and no form of government has ever satisfied its subjects. In this system, the businessmen were piqued by their exclusion from the Senate, the richer plebeians by their exclusion from the equites, and the poorer plebeians resented their poverty, their political disabilities, and their liability to enslavement for debt. The law of the early republic allowed a creditor to imprison a persistently defaulting debtor in a private dungeon, to sell him into slavery, even to kill him. Joint creditors might, said the law, cut up the corpse of the defaulting debtor and divide it among them, a provision apparently never enforced. The plebs demanded that these laws should be repealed and the burden of accrued debt reduced, that the lands won in war and owned by the state should be distributed among the poor instead of being given or sold at nominal prices to the rich, that plebeians should be eligible to the magistracies and the priesthoods, be permitted to intermarry with the orders, and have a representative of their class among the highest officials of the government. The Senate sought to frustrate the agitation by fomenting wars, but it was shocked to find its calls to the colors ignored. In 494 B.C., large masses of the plebs seceded to the sacred mount on the river Anio, 3 miles from the city, and declared that they would neither fight nor work for Rome until their demands had been met. The Senate used every diplomatic or religious device to lure the rebels back. Then, fearing that invasion from without might soon be added to revolt within, it agreed to a cancellation or reduction of debts and the establishment of 2 tribunes and 3 aediles as the elected defenders of the plebs. The plebs returned, but only after taking a solemn oath to kill any man who should ever lay violent hands upon their representatives in the government. This was the opening battle in a class war that ended only with the republic that it destroyed. In 486, the consul Spurius Cassius proposed an allotment of captured lands among the poor. The patricians accused him of currying popular favor with a view to making himself king, and had him killed. This was probably not the first in a long line of agrarian proposals and senatorial assassinations, culminating in the Gracchi and Caesar. In 439, Spurius Melius, who during a famine had distributed wheat to the poor at a low price or free, was slain in his home by an emissary of the Senate, again on the charge of plotting to be king. In 384, Marcus Manlius, who had heroically defended Rome against the Gauls, was put to death on the same charge after he had spent his fortune relieving insolvent debtors. The next step in the climb of the plebs was a demand for definite written and secular laws. Heretofore, the patrician priests had been the recorders and interpreters of the statutes, had kept their records secret, and had used their monopoly and the ritual requirements of the law as weapons against social change. After a long resistance to the new demands, the Senate, in 454, sent a commission of 3 patricians to Greece to study and report on the legislation of Solon and other lawmakers. When they returned, the assembly in 451 chose 10 men, decemviri, to formulate a new code, and gave them supreme governmental power in Rome for 2 years. This commission, under the presidency of a resolute reactionary, Appius Claudius, transformed the old customary law of Rome into the famous 12 tables, submitted them to the assembly, which passed them with some changes, and displayed them in the forum for all who would and could to read. This seemingly trivial event was epical in Roman history and in the history of mankind. It was the first written form of that legal structure which was to be Rome's most signal achievement and her greatest contribution to civilization. When the second year of the commission's tenure ended, it refused to restore the government to the consuls and tribunes, and continued to exercise supreme and ever more irresponsible authority. Appius Claudius, says a story suspiciously like Lucretia's, was stirred with the passion for the beautiful plebeian Virginia, and to secure her for his pleasure had her declared a slave. Her father, Lucius Virginius, protested, and when Claudius refused to hear him, he slew his daughter, rushed out to his legion, and asked its aid in overthrowing the new despot. The enraged plebs once more seceded to the sacred mount, imitating, says Livy, the moderation of their fathers by abstaining from all injury. Learning that the army was supporting the plebs, the patricians gathered in the Senate House, deposed the decemvirs, banished Claudius, restored the consulate, enlarged the tribunate, recognized the inviolability of the people's tribunes, and confirmed to the plebs the right of appealing to the assembly of the centuries from the decision of any magistrate. 4 years later, in 445, the tribune Caius Canulius moved that the plebs should have the right of intermarriage with patricians, and that plebeians should be eligible to the consulate. The Senate, again faced by threats of war from vengeful neighbors, yielded the first point and averted the second by agreeing that thereafter 6 of the tribunes chosen by the centurial assembly should have the authority of consuls. The plebs responded handsomely by choosing all these tribuni militum consulari potestate from the patrician class. The long war with Veii, from 405 to 396, and the assault of the Gauls upon Rome unified the nation for a time and stilled internal strife. But victory and disaster alike left the plebeians destitute. While they fought for their country, their lands were neglected or ravaged, and the interest on their debts mounted beyond possible repayment. The lenders took no excuse but demanded principal and interest, or the imprisonment and enslavement of the borrowers. In 376, the tribunes Licinius and Sextius proposed that interest already paid should be deducted from the principal, the balance to be met in 3 years, that no man should be allowed to own more than 500 jugera, about 300 acres, of land, or to use on them more than a certain proportion of slaves to free laborers, and that one of the two consuls should regularly be chosen from the plebs. For a decade the patricians resisted these proposals. Meanwhile, says Dio Cassius, they stirred up war after war that the people might be too occupied to agitate about the land. At last, threatened with a third secession, the Senate accepted the Licinian laws, and Camillus, leader of the conservatives, celebrated the reconciliation of the classes by building a stately temple of Concord in the Forum. It was a major step in the growth of Rome's limited democracy. From that moment the plebs progressed rapidly towards a formal equality with the orders in politics and law. In 356 a plebeian was made dictator for a year. In 351 the censorship, in 337 the praetorship, and in 300 the priesthoods were opened to the plebs. Finally, in 287 the Senate agreed that the decisions of the tribal assembly should also have the force of law, even when contrary to the resolutions of the Senate. Since in this assembly the patricians could easily be outvoted by the plebs, this lex hortensia was the capstone and triumph of Roman democracy. Nevertheless, the power of the Senate soon recovered after these defeats. The demand for land was quieted by sending Romans as colonists to conquered soil. The cost of winning and holding office, which was unpaid, automatically disqualified the poor. The richer plebeians, having secured political equality and opportunity, now cooperated with the patricians in checking radical legislation. The poorer plebeians, shorn of financial means, ceased for 2 centuries to play a significant role in the affairs of Rome. Businessmen fell in with patrician policy because it gave them contracts for public works, openings for colonial and provincial exploitation, and commissions to collect taxes for the state. The Assembly of the Centuries, whose method of voting gave the aristocracy full control, continued to choose the magistrates, and therefore the Senate. The tribunes, dependent upon the support of rich plebeians, used their office as a conservative force. Every consul, even if chosen by the plebs, became by contagion a zealous conservative when, at the close of his year of office, he was received into the Senate for life. The Senate took the initiative in legislation, and custom sanctioned its authority far beyond the letter of the law. As foreign affairs became more important, the Senate's firm administration of them raised its prestige and power. When in 264 Rome entered upon a century of war with Carthage for the mastery of the Mediterranean, it was the Senate that led the nation through every trial to victory, and an imperiled and desperate people yielded without protest to its leadership and domination. 2. The Constitution of the Republic. 1. The Lawmakers. Let us try to picture to ourselves this complex state, so formed after 5 centuries of development. By common consent, it was one of the ablest and most successful governments that the world has yet seen. Polybius, indeed, considered it an almost literal realization of Aristotle's ideal constitution. It provided the framework, sometimes the battleground, of Roman history. Who among this people were the citizens? Technically, those who had been born or adopted into one of the 3 original tribes of Rome. In practice, this meant all males above 15 years of age who were neither slaves nor aliens, and all aliens who had received a grant of Roman citizenship. Never before or since has citizenship been so jealously guarded or so highly prized. It meant membership in the relatively small group that was soon to rule the whole Mediterranean area. It brought immunity from legal torture or duress, and the right of appeal from any official in the empire to the assembly, or later the emperor, at Rome. Obligations went with these privileges. The citizen, unless quite poor, was liable to military service at call from his 16th to his 60th year, and he could not hold political office until he had served 10 years in the army. His political rights were so bound up with his military duties that his most important voting was done as a member of his regiment, or century. In the days of the kings, he had voted also in the comitia curiata. That is, he and other heads of families had come together
cum ire, in a gathering of the 30 curii, or wards, into which the 3 tribes had been divided. And to the end of the Republic it was this curial assembly that conferred upon the elected magistrates the imperium, or authority to govern. After the fall of the monarchy, the curial assembly rapidly lost its other powers to the comitia centuriata. The soldiers assembled in centuries, originally of 100 men. It was this centurial assembly that chose the magistrates, passed or rejected the measures proposed to it by officials or the Senate, heard appeals from the judgments of magistrates, tried all cases of capital crime charged to Roman citizens, and decided upon war or peace. It was the broad base of both the Roman army and the Roman government. Nevertheless, its powers were narrowly constrained. It could convene only at the call of a consul or a tribune. It could vote only upon such measures as were presented to it by the magistrates or the Senate. It could not discuss or amend these proposals. It could only vote yes or no. The conservative character of its decisions was guaranteed by the class arrangement of its members. At the top were 18 centuries of patricians and businessmen, equites. Then came the first class, men owning 100,000 asses worth of property. An ass, spelled A-S, would now be equivalent in purchasing power to approximately 6 cents of United States currency in 1942. These had 80 centuries, or 8,000 men in the assembly. The second class embraced citizens owning between 75,000 and 100,000 asses, the third between 50,000 and 75,000 asses, the fourth between 25,000 and 50,000 asses, and each of these classes had 20 centuries. The fifth class included citizens owning between 11,000 and 25,000 asses and had 30 centuries. All citizens possessing under 11,000 asses were formed into 1 century. Each century cast 1 vote, determined by a majority of its members. A small majority in 1 century could cancel a large majority in another and give the victory to a numerical minority. Since each century voted in the order of its financial rank, and its vote was announced as soon as taken, the agreement of the first 2 groups gave at once 98 votes, a majority of the whole, so that the lower classes seldom voted at all. Voting was direct. Citizens who could not come to Rome for the meeting had no representation in the assembly. All this was no mere device to disfranchise the peasants and the plebs. The classification of centuries had been made by the census to distinguish men for taxation as well as for war. The Romans thought it just that the right to vote should be proportioned to taxes paid and military duties required. Citizens with less than 11,000 asses of property had altogether only 1 centurial vote, but correspondingly they paid a negligible tax and were in normal times exempt from military service. Of the proletariat until Marius's day, nothing was asked except prolific parentage. Despite some later changes, the centurial assembly remained a frankly conservative and aristocratic institution. Doubtless as an offset to this, the plebs had from the beginning of the Republic held its own assemblies, the concilia plebis. Out of these councils probably came the comitia populi tributa, which we find exercising legislative power as early as 357 B.C. In this tribal assembly of the people, the voters were arranged according to tribe and residence, on the basis of the Servian census. Each tribe had 1 vote, and the rich counted for no more than the poor. After the recognition of its legislative authority by the Senate in 287, the power of the tribal assembly grew until by 200 it had become the chief source of private law in Rome. It chose the tribunes, that is, tribal representatives of the people, or tribuni plebis, as distinct from the tribuni militares, elected by the centuries. Here, too, however, there was no discussion by the people. A magistrate proposed a law and defended it. Another magistrate might speak against it. The assembly listened and voted yes or no. Though by its constitution it was more progressive than the centurial assembly, it was far from radical. 31 of its 35 tribes were rural, and their members, mostly owners of land, were cautious men. The urban proletariat, confined to 4 tribes, was politically powerless before Marius and after Caesar. The Senate remained supreme. Its original membership of clan heads was recruited by the regular admission of ex-consuls and ex-censors, and the censors were authorized to keep its numbers up to 300 by nominating to it men of patrician or equestrian rank. Membership was for life, but the Senate or a censor could dismiss any member detected in crime or serious moral offense. The august body convened at the call of any major magistrate in the curia or Senate house facing the forum. By a pleasant custom, the members brought their sons with them to attend in silence and to learn statesmanship and chicanery at first hand. Theoretically, the Senate might discuss and decide only such issues as were presented to it by a magistrate, and its decisions were merely advice, senatus consulta, without the force of law. Actually, its prestige was so great that the magistrates nearly always accepted its recommendations, and seldom submitted to the assemblies any measure not already sanctioned by the Senate. Its decisions were subject to veto by any tribune, and a defeated minority of the Senate might appeal to the assemblies, but these procedures were rare except in revolution. The magistrates held power for a year only, while the senators were chosen for life. Inevitably, this deathless monarch dominated the bearers of a brief authority. The conduct of foreign relations, the making of alliances and treaties, the waging of war, the government of the colonies and provinces, the management and distribution of the public lands, the control of the treasury and its disbursements, all these were exclusive functions of the Senate and gave it immense power. It was legislature, executive, and judiciary in one. It acted as judge in crimes like treason, conspiracy, or assassination, and appointed from its membership the judges in most major civil trials. When a crisis came, it could issue its most formidable decree, the senatus consultum ultimum, that the consuls should see to it that no harm should come to the state, a decree that established martial law and gave the consuls absolute command of all persons and property. The Senate of the Republic often abused its authority, defended corrupt officials, waged war ruthlessly, exploited conquered provinces greedily, and suppressed the aspirations of the people for a larger share in the prosperity of Rome. But never elsewhere, except from Trajan to Aurelius, have so much energy, wisdom, and skill been applied to statesmanship, and never elsewhere has the idea of service to the state so dominated a government or a people. These senators were not supermen. They made serious mistakes, sometimes vacillated in their policies, often lost the vision of empire in the lust for personal gain. But most of them had been magistrates, administrators, and commanders. Some of them, as proconsuls, had ruled provinces as large as kingdoms. Many of them came of families that had given statesmen or generals to Rome for hundreds of years. It was impossible that a body made up of such men should escape some measure of excellence. The Senate was at its worst in victory, at its best in defeat. It could carry forward policies that spanned generations and centuries. It could begin a war in 264 and end it in 146 B.C. When Cineas, the philosopher who had come to Rome as envoy of Pyrrhus in 280, had heard the Senate's deliberations and observed its men, he reported to the new Alexander that here was no mere gathering of venal politicians, no haphazard council of mediocre minds, but in dignity and statesmanship veritably an assemblage of kings. 2. The magistrates. The major officials were elected by the centurial, the minor by the tribal assembly. Each office was held by a collegium of 2 or more colleagues, equal in power. All offices except the censorship ran for only a year. The same office could be held by the same person only once in 10 years. A year had to elapse between leaving one office and taking another, and in the interval the ex-official could be prosecuted for malfeasance. The aspirant to a political career, if he survived a decade in the army, might seek election as one of the quaestors who, under the Senate and the consuls, managed the expenditure of state funds and assisted the praetors in preventing and investigating crime. If he pleased his electors or his influential supporters, he might later be chosen one of the 4 aediles charged with the care of buildings, aqueducts, streets, markets, theaters, brothels, saloons, police courts, and public games. If again successful, he might be made one of the 4 praetors who in war led armies and in peace acted as judges and interpreters of the law. At about this point in the cursus honorum, or sequence of offices, the citizen who had made a name for integrity and judgment might become one of the 2 censors, valuators, chosen every 5th year by the centurial assembly. One of them would take the quinquennial census of the citizens and assess their property for political and military status and for taxation. The censors were required to examine the character and record of every candidate for office. They watched over the honor of women, the education of children, the treatment of slaves, the collection or farming of taxes, the construction of public buildings, the letting of governmental property or contracts, and the proper cultivation of the land. They could lower the rank of any citizen or remove any member of the Senate whom they found guilty of immorality or crime. And in this function the power of either censor was immune to the veto of the other. They could try to check extravagance by raising taxes on luxuries. They prepared and published a budget of state expenditures on a 5-year plan. At the close of their 18-month term, they would gather the citizens together in a solemn ceremony of national purification, or lustrum, as a means of maintaining cordial relations with the gods. Appius Claudius Caecus, the blind, great-grandson of the Decemvir, was the first to make the censorship rival the consulate in dignity. During his term, in 312, he built the Appian Aqueduct and the Appian Way, promoted rich plebeians to the Senate, reformed land laws and state finances, helped to break down the priestly and patrician monopoly and manipulation of the law, left his mark on Roman grammar, rhetoric, and poetry, and by his deathbed speech against Pyrrhus decided the Roman conquest of Italy. Theoretically, one of the two consuls, or consultants, had to be a plebeian. Actually, very few plebeians were chosen, for even the plebs preferred men of education and training for an office that would have to deal with every executive phase of peace and war throughout the Mediterranean. On the eve of the election, the magistrate in charge of it observed the stars to see if they favored the presentation of the several candidates' names. Presiding over the centurial assembly on the morrow, he might offer to its choice only those names that the auspices had approved. In this way, the aristocracy discouraged upstarts and demagogues, and in most cases the assembly, awed or intimidated, submitted to the pious fraud. The candidate appeared in person, dressed in a plain white, or candidus, toga to emphasize the simplicity of his life and morals, and perhaps the more easily to show the scars he had won in the field. If elected, he entered office on the ensuing March 15th. The consul took on sanctity by leading the state in the most solemn religious rites. In peace, he summoned and presided over the Senate and the Assembly, initiated legislation, administered justice, and in general executed the laws. In war, he levied armies, raised funds, and shared with his fellow consul command of the legions. If both of them died or were captured during their year of office, the Senate declared an interregnum and appointed an interrex, or interval king, for 5 days while a new election was being prepared. The word suggests that the consuls had inherited, for their brief term, the powers of the kings. The consul was limited by the equal authority of his colleague, by the pressure of the Senate, and by the veto power of the tribune. After 367 BC, 14 military tribunes were chosen to lead the tribes in war, and 10 tribunes of the plebs to represent them in peace. These 10 were sacrosancti. It was a sacrilege as well as a capital crime to lay violent hands upon them except under a legitimate dictatorship. Their function was to protect the people against the government and to stop by one word, veto, I forbid, the whole machinery of the state, whenever to any one of them this seemed desirable. As a silent observer, the tribune could attend the meetings of the Senate, report its deliberations to the people, and by his veto deprive the Senate's decisions of all legal force. The door of his inviolable home remained open day and night to any citizen who sought his protection or his aid, and this right of sanctuary or asylum provided the equivalent of habeas corpus. Seated in his tribunal, he would act as judge, and from his decision there was no appeal except to the assembly of the tribes. It was his duty to secure the accused a fair trial, and when possible to win some pardon for the condemned. How did the aristocracy retain its ascendancy despite these obstructive powers? First, by limiting them to the city of Rome and to times of peace. In war, the tribunes obeyed the consuls. Secondly, by persuading the tribal assembly to elect wealthy plebeians as tribunes. The prestige of wealth and the diffidence of poverty moved the people to choose the rich to defend the poor. Thirdly, by allowing the numbers of tribunes to be raised from 4 to 10. If only one of these 10 would listen to reason or money, his veto could frustrate the rest. In the course of time, the tribunes became so dependable that they could be trusted to convene the Senate, take part in its deliberations, and become life members of it after their terms. If all these maneuvers failed, a last bulwark of social order remained: dictatorship. The Romans recognized that in times of national chaos or peril, their liberties and privileges and all the checks and balances that they had created for their own protection might impede the rapid and united action needed to save the state. In such cases, the Senate could declare an emergency, and then either consul could name a dictator. In every instance but one, the dictators came from the upper classes, but it must be said that the aristocracy rarely abused the possibilities of this office. The dictator received almost complete authority over all persons and property, but he could not use public funds without the Senate's consent, and his term was limited to 6 months or a year. All dictators but 2 obeyed these restrictions, honoring the story of how Cincinnatus, called from the plough to save the state in 456 BC, returned to his farm as soon as the task was done. When this precedent was violated by Sulla and Caesar, the Republic passed back into the monarchy out of which it had come. 3. The beginnings of Roman law. Within this unique constitution, the magistrates administered a system of law based upon the 12 tables of the decemvirs. Before that epical enactment, Roman law had been a mixture of tribal customs, royal edicts, and priestly commands. Mos maiorum, the way of the ancients, remained to the end of pagan Rome the exemplar of morals and a source of law. And though imagination and edification idealized the ruthless burghers of the early republic, the tales told of them helped educators to form a stoic character in Roman youth. For the rest, early Roman law was a priestly rule, a branch of religion, surrounded with sacred sanctions and solemn rites. Law was both lex and jus, command and justice. It was a relation not only between man and man, but between man and the gods. Crime was a disturbance of that relation, of the pax deorum, or peace of the gods. Law and punishment were in theory designed to maintain or restore that relation and peace. The priests declared what was right and wrong, fas et nefas, on what days the courts might open and the assemblies meet. All questions regarding marriage or divorce, celibacy or incest, wills or transfers, or the rights of children required the priest as now so many of them require the lawyer. Only the priests knew the formulas without which hardly anything could be legally done. They were in Rome the first jurisconsulti, consultants in the law, counselors. They were the first to give responsa, or legal opinions. The laws were recorded in their books, and these volumes were so securely guarded from the plebs that suspicion charged the priests with altering the texts on occasion to suit ecclesiastical or aristocratic ends. The 12 tables effected a double juristic revolution, the publication and secularization of Roman law. Like other codes of the 6th and 5th centuries, those of Carondus, Seleucus, Lycurgus, Solon, they represented a change from uncertain, unwritten custom to definite written law. They were a result of increasing literacy and democracy. The jus civile, or law of citizens, freed itself in these tables from the jus divinum, or divine law. Rome decided not to be a theocracy. The priestly monopoly was further deflated when the secretary of Appius Claudius the Blind published in 304 a calendar of court days, dies fasti, days of utterance, and a formulary of proper legal procedures, which had till then been known to few but the priests. Secularization took another step when Coruncanius, in 280, began the first known public instruction in Roman law. From that time onward, the lawyer replaced the priest and dominated the mind and life of Rome. This book is continued on Cassette 2, Side 1.